Imagine stepping into a place designed to strip away nearly every fragment of your normal life. No freedom of movement, no privacy, no sense of normalcy. That's ADX Florence in Colorado, the United States' most secure federal prison, a facility often called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. For the men who arrive here, the first meal is more than just food. It is the literal and symbolic beginning of a new, highly controlled existence. It is a small moment, yet it carries immense weight, marking the transition from life outside to life inside. In ADX Florence, this first meal is solitary, silent, and highly structured. Each inmate eats alone in a small, concrete cell. There is no conversation, no sharing, no human connection, just a tray of food delivered through a slot in the door. For some, it is a moment of fear and disorientation. For others, a quiet acceptance of the system's rules. This meal is also a psychological rite of passage. It signals that the inmate is now under the strict control of the institution, where every aspect of daily life is monitored. When to eat, when to sleep, and when to exercise. The food itself, simple and routine, mirrors the regimented life they will now live, where predictability is key to maintaining order in a place designed to contain individuals deemed the most dangerous or high risk. Yet even in such extreme conditions, this meal represents the beginning of adaptation. It is the first test of patience, resilience, and self-control. How an inmate responds to this first meal can shape their mental and emotional survival. Will they succumb to despair, or will they begin to find a way to endure? In reflecting on the first meal inside ADX Florence, we see a microcosm of life in America's most secure prison. Isolation, control, and the stark reminder of consequences. It is a small act, but it symbolizes the start of a long journey, where survival is measured not in freedom, but in discipline, adaptability, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. ADX Florence is not just any prison. It is the pinnacle of maximum security in the United States, a place specifically designed to contain the most dangerous, high-risk, and high-profile inmates. Located in the remote mountains of Florence, Colorado, this federal supermax facility was opened in 1994, and it operates under the principle that extreme isolation can reduce the threat posed by certain individuals to society and to other prisoners. Unlike typical prisons, ADX Florence is not about rehabilitation or social reintegration. It is about control, containment, and management of those deemed too dangerous for ordinary correctional institutions. The architecture of ADX Florence itself communicates its purpose. Concrete walls, narrow corridors, steel doors, and surveillance systems dominate the environment, giving it a fortress-like appearance. Every design choice, from the thickness of the walls to the size of the cells, is intended to limit movement and interaction, creating a space where the inmate's life can be monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are virtually no communal areas. Even meals, recreation, and medical care are conducted in ways that minimize contact between inmates and with staff, underscoring the isolation that defines life in the prison. ADX Florence houses a diverse population of inmates, ranging from convicted terrorists, organized crime leaders, and violent criminals, to those who have repeatedly attempted to escape or commit serious acts of violence in other correctional facilities. The inmates here are considered high risk, not only because of the severity of their crimes, but also because of their potential to disrupt the safety and order of other prisons. In this sense, ADX is a prison within a prison, a facility designed to hold individuals for whom typical security measures are insufficient. The reputation of ADX Florence contributes to its almost mythic status in American culture. It is often portrayed in media as an impenetrable fortress, a place where the United States locks away its most dangerous individuals, and where the conditions are harsh enough to strip away almost all normal human freedoms. For those arriving for the first time, the facility's cold, stark environment can be overwhelming, signaling that they are entering a world governed entirely by rules, schedules, and rigid authority. The very air inside ADX seems to hum with control, as if the walls themselves enforce the institution's policies. The first experience of stepping inside this facility is jarring. The transition from the outside world, with its light, noise, and freedom of choice, to a place where movement is limited, communication is monitored, and even a simple gesture must follow strict protocol, is profound. ADX Florence is designed to make an immediate psychological impact, ensuring that every inmate understands that life here is fundamentally different. Every procedure, every interaction, and even the first meal begins within this context of absolute control, shaping the inmate's perception of what it means to exist within the walls of America's most secure prison. The first meal inside ADX Florence is far more than a simple act of nourishment. It is a profound symbol, a quiet but unmistakable marker of transition. For most of us, a meal is a routine, often social activity, a time to gather, share, and connect with others. But in the context of ADX Florence, the first meal is stripped of all social meaning. It becomes a solitary ritual, a deliberate exercise in adaptation and acceptance, signaling that the individual is no longer living in the familiar rhythms of the outside world. This meal represents the moment when freedom, in all its ordinary and subtle forms, begins to disappear. In a broader sense, this first meal is a psychological gateway. It is the first structured interaction between the inmate and the institution, a controlled, observed, and intentional act that establishes the rules of life within the prison. The tray of food delivered through the cell door is not just sustenance. It is a tangible message. Your life is now defined by regulation, isolation, and surveillance. The simplicity of the meal, the silence in which it is consumed, and the mechanical regularity of its delivery all convey the immense power the institution holds over every aspect of the inmate's existence. In this way, the first meal serves as a form of initiation into a new world where predictability is the only constant and compliance is essential. The symbolism extends further. The meal embodies the concept of control and order, principles central to ADX Florence's operation. It communicates that life here is measured in small, regimented routines, where even the most basic human needs are governed by the institution. Eating alone in a concrete cell, with no interaction or sensory engagement beyond the tray itself, reinforces the inmate's isolation and emphasizes the extreme nature of their new environment. In this sense, the first meal is not merely a beginning. It is a demonstration of power, a carefully designed encounter that forces reflection on what freedom and personal agency once meant and what they now no longer entail. For the inmate, this meal can trigger a wide array of emotions. It may spark fear, uncertainty, or despair. For some, it may bring a quiet resignation, an acknowledgement of the reality they now face. For others, it could be a moment of mental preparation, an initial test of endurance and self-discipline. How an inmate experiences this first meal, whether with panic, defiance, or cautious adaptation, can shape their ability to navigate the intense isolation and control that defines ADX Florence. Ultimately, the first meal is both literal and symbolic. It represents the start of life inside the prison, a life stripped of spontaneity and freedom, yet one that demands resilience. The simplicity of the meal contrasts sharply with the complexity of the emotions it evokes, and this juxtaposition underscores the profound psychological impact of incarceration in a place like ADX Florence. Each bite, each swallow, is not just physical sustenance, but a reminder of the institutional power, the isolation, and the strict structure that will define daily life in the world's most secure prison. In ADX Florence, solitude is not a circumstance. It is the defining condition of life. The first meal, eaten in complete isolation, exemplifies this reality. Unlike in ordinary prisons or in daily life outside, there is no communal dining, no conversation with fellow inmates, no casual social exchange. Each inmate receives a tray of food, often through a small slot in the steel cell door, and is expected to eat quietly, alone, in a space that is little more than a concrete box. The walls, the the floor, the narrow dimensions of the cell, and the absence of natural light all contribute to an environment that magnifies the weight of isolation, turning a simple act like eating into an experience of stark, almost oppressive solitude. This solitude is carefully engineered. The design of ADX Florence ensures that inmates rarely see or interact with one another. Hallways are monitored. Recreation occurs in separate cages or enclosures, and even communication with staff is minimal and highly regulated. Within this system, the act of eating alone is more than convenience. It is a tool of psychological control. It reinforces the inmates' understanding that in this world, human connection is limited, and survival requires learning to exist within the confines of one's own mind. The first meal becomes the first encounter with this extreme form of isolation, a small but profound lesson in what it means to live in a place that removes nearly all external sources of comfort, companionship, or distraction. The solitary nature of this meal also heightens every sensory detail. The sound of the tray sliding through the door, the clatter of utensils against metal, the smell of the food, all are amplified in a quiet cell. Without the noise and movement of others, each element becomes more pronounced, intensifying the perception of confinement. For new inmates, this sensory awareness can be disorienting. The absence of social cues and shared human presence forces the mind to confront itself in a way most people never experience. Eating alone in such an environment can make minutes feel like hours, transforming the ordinary rhythm of a meal into an exercise in patience, mindfulness, and psychological endurance. Furthermore, the solitary experience of the first meal symbolizes the larger structure of life inside ADX Florence. Inmates will spend nearly every day in their cells, with interaction limited to short, structured periods. The first meal is the first lesson in this regimen. It teaches that personal time, mental space, and even bodily functions are conducted under strict rules and observation. There is no privacy in the conventional sense. Yet within the confines of the cell, the inmate's own mind becomes the primary companion, the only arena where autonomy remains, even if limited. This combination of physical restriction and mental freedom, however narrow, is central to survival. The psychological effect of eating in solitude is profound. For some, it may induce anxiety, despair, or a sense of claustrophobia. For others, it becomes the first test of mental resilience, a moment to begin cultivating patience, self-discipline, and acceptance. The solitude of the meal reflects the reality that life inside ADX Florence is fundamentally solitary. Decisions, reflections, coping mechanisms, and emotional regulation must occur largely within the confines of the mind. The first meal, therefore, is more than just sustenance. It is the initiation into a state of existence where isolation is both a challenge and a constant companion, shaping how inmates approach every subsequent day in the prison. The first meal inside ADX Florence is not merely about filling the stomach. It is a profound psychological experience that immediately confronts the inmate with the reality of extreme isolation and control. In this context, food becomes a lens through which the mind perceives the new world it has entered. The meal is a quiet, solitary event, but its mental weight is enormous. For many, it is the first moment in which the sheer intensity of their confinement truly registers, when the abstract concept of supermax imprisonment becomes a tangible, lived experience. Psychologists and prison experts have long noted that extreme isolation, like that experienced in ADX Florence, can have profound effects on cognition, mood, and emotional stability. The first meal acts as an unspoken psychological test. How will the inmate respond to being alone with their thoughts, stripped of social interaction, sensory stimulation, and familiar routines? The experience can trigger a variety of reactions, from panic, agitation, and frustration to quiet reflection, resignation, or even numbness. The solitude and silence force the mind to confront itself in a way that most individuals never encounter, making the meal a symbolic initiation into the mental demands of supermax life. For some inmates, the first meal triggers a sense of loss, not just of freedom, but of identity and agency. Outside the prison walls, meals are often social, cultural, or personal experiences. Inside ADX Florence, those associations are stripped away. There is no choice, no conversation, no connection. The sterile environment and regimented delivery system amplify the perception of control, sending a clear psychological message. Every aspect of your life is now mediated and monitored by the institution. This can create a sense of powerlessness, which inmates must learn to manage if they hope to maintain their mental stability over time. Yet the psychological impact of the first meal is not purely negative. It also provides the inmate with a moment to begin cultivating resilience and self-discipline. The meal acts as a controlled introduction to the rhythms of prison life, developing coping strategies that will be crucial for survival in the months or years ahead. Moreover, the psychological effect of eating alone extends beyond the immediate meal. It sets the tone for every subsequent interaction and daily activity. In ADX Florence, routines are rigid, and the first meal becomes the reference point for understanding the boundaries of life inside the prison. It reinforces the inmate's awareness that control is external, dictated by the institution, and that personal will must operate within strict limits. How an individual approaches this first encounter, with anxiety, anger, detachment, or acceptance, can influence their ability to withstand the psychological pressures of isolation, monotony, and constant surveillance. Ultimately, the first meal inside ADX Florence is a mental crucible. It compresses into a short period the broader psychological realities of life in a supermax prison: solitude, control, adaptation, and reflection. Each bite is a test of emotional endurance, and each moment of silence challenges the mind to confront itself and its capacity for resilience. The first meal, therefore, is not simply food. It is the first deliberate step into a psychological landscape defined by control, isolation, and the relentless demands of survival. One of the defining characteristics of life inside ADX Florence is structure. From the moment an inmate arrives, every action, every movement, and every choice is regulated by the institution. The first meal is the earliest and most immediate introduction to this rigid framework, a carefully orchestrated exercise in routine that communicates both control and expectation. Unlike the outside world, where meals are flexible, social, or even spontaneous, in ADX Florence, the timing, location, and manner in which a meal is consumed are strictly dictated. There is no deviation, no negotiation. The structure is absolute, and the inmate's adaptation to it is essential for survival. The tray of food delivered through the slot in the door is only the most visible manifestation of this structure. Behind it lies a complex system of rules, schedules, and protocols designed to minimize risk and maintain order. Meals occur at precise times, cells are cleaned according to strict routines, and movement within the facility is coordinated to prevent unsanctioned contact between inmates. Each component of daily life, when to wake, when to eat, when to exercise, and when to sleep, is meticulously scheduled. The first meal is a microcosm of this broader reality. It is a simple, controlled event, yet it represents the broader order that will govern the inmate's life from that point forward. Structure within ADX Florence serves multiple purposes. Practically, it ensures safety for staff and inmates, reducing opportunities for violence or disorder. Psychologically, it instills a sense of predictability, even within extreme confinement. While the environment is intentionally isolating and harsh, the regularity of routines provides a framework upon which inmates can orient themselves. The first meal, eaten at a set time, in a specific location, and in silence, begins to establish these rhythms. It teaches the inmate that predictability is not just a convenience, but a necessity, a tool for maintaining both order and mental stability. The routine also reinforces the concept of control, both institutional and personal. In ADX Florence, The institution controls the timing, portion, and content of every meal, demonstrating the extent of external authority over the inmate's life. At the same time, the inmate must exert internal control to navigate these routines successfully. Sitting alone in the cell, consuming a tray of food according to strict rules, the individual begins to learn self-discipline, patience, and the importance of compliance. The first meal thus functions as an early lesson in balancing submission to authority with the cultivation of mental resilience, a skill that will be essential for enduring the long days and weeks that follow. Beyond safety and discipline, structure and routine also act as a psychological buffer against the extreme isolation and monotony of ADX Florence. In a world where human contact is rare, knowing exactly what will happen, when it will happen, and how it must be performed can provide a small but vital sense of stability. The first meal is a clear demonstration of this principle. It is a predictable, controlled experience in an environment where unpredictability is otherwise limited to the mind's internal struggles. By participating in this routine, the inmate begins to internalize the rhythms of prison life, establishing a foundation for the mental and emotional endurance that will be necessary for long-term survival. In essence, structure and routine are the invisible scaffolding of life inside ADX Florence, and the first meal is the initial beam in that framework. It teaches the inmate that existence here is measured in small, precise actions, and that adherence to these patterns is crucial. The precision, predictability, and repetition of these routines shape every moment of daily life, influencing both behavior and mindset. The first meal, though seemingly simple, is a carefully orchestrated introduction to the disciplined and regimented life that will dominate the inmates every day, signaling that freedom of choice has been replaced by the necessity of compliance and endurance. The first meal inside ADX Florence is not only a physical experience, but also an emotional crucible, a moment in which the human psyche is confronted with the stark realities of confinement, isolation, and loss of control. In this environment, emotions are heightened because every detail of life has been stripped of familiarity and comfort. The tray of food, simple and unadorned, becomes a catalyst for a complex array of feelings, ranging from fear and anxiety to resignation and quiet acceptance. For many inmates, the emotional intensity of this first meal can be overwhelming, marking a vivid beginning to life inside the prison. Fear is often the most immediate reaction. The inmate may feel uncertain about what is to come, how long the sentence will last, what threats exist within the facility, or how they will cope with being confined in near total isolation. The first meal forces the individual to sit alone with these thoughts, unable to escape from the realization that their freedom has been dramatically curtailed. The silence of the cell, the methodical delivery of the food, and the absence of human connection magnify these fears, making the mind hyper-aware of both the environment and the consequences of past actions. Even a simple act like lifting a fork or opening a tray can be accompanied by a heightened sense of vulnerability, underscoring the psychological intensity of the moment. Despair is another common emotional reaction. The realization that life inside ADX Florence will be monotonous, restricted, and isolated can trigger feelings of hopelessness. Unlike traditional prison experiences, where inmates may interact with others or engage in structured activities, the supermax environment offers almost no distractions. The first meal can crystallize this reality. The sterile setting, lack of interaction, and regimented nature of the experience can make the inmate acutely aware of the long days ahead, the absence of social or emotional outlets, and the psychological toll of living under constant observation. Yet, amidst fear and despair, there is also the possibility of acceptance. The first meal can be a moment where the inmate begins to understand the rules, boundaries, and expectations of life inside ADX Florence. Emotional survival often begins with acknowledgement, recognizing the conditions of confinement and starting to mentally adapt. Some inmates may approach the meal with a quiet, internal determination, understanding that how they respond emotionally now will influence their ability to endure in the long term. This early adaptation can be subtle: a deep breath, a slow consumption of the food, a focus on the routine rather than the circumstances. But it marks the beginning of psychological adjustment, the first step in navigating the extreme environment of the prison. The first meal also exposes the inmate to the emotional challenge of isolation in a new, highly controlled context. In the outside world, meals are social experiences that provide comfort, connection, and a sense of normalcy. Inside ADX Florence, the absence of these elements intensifies emotional awareness, forcing the mind to confront the profound loneliness inherent in supermax incarceration. The individual must wrestle with feelings that might otherwise be buffered by human interaction: anxiety, boredom, frustration, or even anger, all amplified by the stark environment. The first meal becomes a mirror, reflecting both the internal emotional state and the external conditions of confinement, highlighting the dual nature of survival, maintaining physical health while managing emotional well-being. Finally, emotional reactions to the first meal are highly personal and variable. Some inmates may experience initial panic or agitation, while others might feel resignation or even quiet curiosity about how they will endure. These emotions are not fleeting. They can set the tone for subsequent days, influencing how the inmate approaches structure, routine, and mental resilience. The first meal, in this sense, is an emotional barometer, a revealing moment that demonstrates the power of the institution not just over the body, but over the mind and spirit. It is in this combination of fear, despair, and tentative acceptance that the inmate begins the complex process of psychological adaptation necessary for surviving life inside ADX Florence. The first meal inside ADX Florence is not simply about nourishment or routine. It is an early, deliberate test of resilience. For inmates entering the prison, the experience is designed to challenge both mental and emotional endurance, confronting them with the reality that life in a supermax facility is not just restrictive, but psychologically demanding. In this sense, the first meal becomes a microcosm of the broader struggle they will face: the need to adapt, persevere, and maintain control in an environment that is fundamentally designed to push them to their limits. Resilience, in this context, is not merely about toughness or stoicism. It is about the ability to navigate extreme conditions without allowing despair, fear, or frustration to overwhelm the mind. The first meal exposes inmates to a combination of isolation, monotony, and sensory deprivation, all elements that can quickly erode psychological stability if not managed carefully. Sitting alone in a concrete cell, with only a tray of food as a point of focus, the inmate is forced to confront the challenge of self-regulation, managing thoughts, emotions, and impulses in the absence of social support or distraction. Each bite, each moment of silence, becomes a small but significant test of endurance. The structured nature of the meal amplifies this test. There is no conversation, no communal activity, and no opportunity to divert attention from the experience. The inmate cannot rely on familiar coping mechanisms, such as social interaction, humor, or shared experience. Instead, the first meal demands internal fortitude, the ability to focus, reflect, and maintain composure in the face of discomfort. This initial encounter establishes the mental framework necessary for long-term survival, teaching the inmate that resilience is built not through escape or resistance, but through adaptation and the disciplined management of one's own thoughts and reactions. Furthermore, the first meal highlights the subtle but powerful ways in which ADX Florence challenges an inmate's endurance. Even small details, the timing of the meal, the method of delivery, the unchanging contents of the tray, are carefully designed to confront the mind with monotony and control. These seemingly minor factors accumulate to create a profound psychological pressure, testing patience, attention, and emotional stability. How the inmate responds to these early challenges can foreshadow their ability to cope with months or years of isolation, strict routines, and continuous surveillance. The first meal is, therefore, both a symbolic and practical measure of resilience, signaling to the individual the importance of mental strength in a place where freedom and comfort are nearly non-existent. Resilience is further tested by the emotional reactions the meal provokes. Feelings of fear, frustration, or despair are natural, yet the ability to acknowledge these emotions without succumbing to them is critical. The first meal becomes a laboratory for mental endurance, an environment in which the inmate practices self-discipline, emotional regulation, and cognitive adaptation. The lesson is clear. Survival in ADX Florence depends not only on physical compliance with the rules, but on the cultivation of inner strength, patience, and the capacity to endure discomfort without losing composure. In addition, the first meal offers an opportunity for the inmate to begin understanding personal limits and developing coping strategies. Some may focus on small routines, such as eating deliberately and slowly, reflecting internally, or mentally organizing the day ahead. Others may use the solitude to process emotions, set intentions, or build mental frameworks for enduring the monotony and isolation. Each approach is a form of resilience in action, demonstrating that even in extreme conditions, the human mind can find ways to adapt and survive. The first meal is the initial arena in which this skill is tested, establishing a foundation for the longer, more challenging journey ahead in ADX Florence. Ultimately, the first meal is not merely a physical act. It is a measure of endurance, a test of resilience, and a training ground for the mental discipline required to navigate one of the most extreme environments in the world. The inmate's response to this first solitary, structured, emotionally charged experience can determine how effectively they will manage the months or years of confinement to come, shaping the trajectory of life inside America's most secure prison.